Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this edition of Leak Project. I'm your host, Rex Bear, and we have famous Nick Redfern with us again, author of 40 awesome, mind-bending, incredible books. You can go to nickredfern14.blogspot.com, pick up your latest book of Nick's. I'll tell you, it's just, I was telling Nick before we started talking, he puts together incredible books like some people put together blog posts or Facebook posts. I mean, just so much information, up to 40 books now. This is incredible. I've read several of his works, and they never disappoint. His newest book, 365 Days of UFOs, is mind-bending. We're talking dead aliens held in military bases, men in black, black-eyed children, black helicopters, reptilians, aliens on the moon, and more. 365 days of goodness. Hey, it's great to have you on the show with us here at Leak Project, Nick. How the heck are you?
Hey, Rex. I'm doing good, thanks. And thanks for having me on again.
Absolutely. We definitely need to do this more often. I always enjoy speaking with you, and I know that the times we've talked in the past, literally, I mean, just the information you gave us as an audience, I had to digest that over several weeks because it was just so powerful, and it really makes you think. One of the questions that I want to ask you before we get started is, with all the research that you've done, compiling 40 books of incredible data, a lot of this stuff is declassified information from the military, Department of Defense, etc. Do you believe in a lot of these stories?
Well, yeah. I mean, what I try and do with any investigation is, you try and be unbiased and just see where the story leads. And, when it comes to things like UFOs, I think, from my perspective, there's a lot of different things going on, and each case needs to be sort of looked at on its own merit. I think some UFOs are legitimate craft and beings from somewhere else, whether they're extraterrestrial or multidimensional or time travelers or who knows what they are, but there's something from somewhere else. But equally, I think some UFOs are probably highly classified military vehicles that, they're still on the, behind the scenes. They're not sort of out in the open yet. And so I think, that's why it's important to just look at the case and investigate it in the same that you would if you're doing any sort of investigative journalism. You just go where the facts are and then present it for the reader rather than try and force fit anything into any particular belief system.
That's what I like about you, Nick, and I do my best to be as neutral as possible on the Leak Project as well when we interview guests, so that way we can find out their truths. Now, if we could get into the dead aliens held by the military, I mean, talk to us about some of that. Is this new information that you've recently obtained?
Yeah, I mean, basically what it is with the book, as you mentioned, it's like called 365 Days of UFOs because each day of the year has a different UFO case concerning it. And I think there are like 5 or 6 stories I've got in the book where people have related to me accounts where either they or family members had seen the remains of what we could only really call dead aliens held by various military agencies. And several of the ones I talk about were in the United States and one in the UK and a couple more. But they're also they're intriguing because they follow a pattern, particularly with the American ones, where a lot of this activity reportedly stems from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. Now, in the late 40s through the early 50s and through to the late 60s, we know for sure that Wright-Patterson was a hub of UFO research and activity at the time. And that was because that essentially is where all the research was done. Now, there's a full admittance that research was being done into UFOs at Wright-Patterson at that time. But the other story, the more controversial one, that there are sort of bunker-type environments deep below the base where there are these alien bodies preserved in sort of cryogenic storage or preserved in chemicals. Those stories have been officially denied. And yet we have a lot of old-timers, military old-timers, come forward talking about seeing them. And the 3 or 4 cases I've got in the book from the US, as I said, various days of various years, they're eerily similar, where people were taken down into deep vaults, sort of 30, 40, 50 feet under the base itself, and into these chambers where they saw what looked kind of almost like missiles like lying on their side. But then as they got closer, they could see they were tanks containing these small bodies. And as I said, in some cases, they were sort of in like a frosty cryogenic situation to preserve them. Others were packed in chemicals, and they were typically described as very small, about 3 to 4 feet high, with large heads, and sometimes large black eyes, and other occasions almost like a slanted human eye. And many of these people didn't speak out until their sort of grandparents or the grandfather who told the story had passed on. And this kind of demonstrates almost like the fear factor that the people have even decades later about should we say anything or not. So it's it's an interesting part of UFO history, which if we could get to the bottom of it, could actually blow the whole thing wide open, really.
Now, you said some of them were underground, like maybe 30, 40, 50 feet.
Yeah.
Were those all in Dayton, Ohio, or were those in different areas?
Well, the ones that I talk about in the book were below Dayton, Ohio. But there are other stories that have surfaced as well, such as allegedly being, again, sort of massive bunkers deep below Area 51 in Nevada, and where there are claims about similar storage. There's also a story about Norton Air Force Base in California that at one point in the 50s was supposedly a place where a number of bodies at least were held. So, but what's interesting is that it's not like we get stories where these bodies are supposedly scattered around all across the US. It's interesting because it seems to be this same handful of bases over and over again.
Did they describe the details of the beans? Were they like what you would see your typical grays in the Hollywood films?
Well, kind of similar. The problem was for some of them, when they saw them where they were sort of cryogenically frozen, and the glass was kind of frosty and things like that. It was hard to get a full picture of them, but they were all sort of unanimous that they were humanoid with oversized heads, and anywhere from about 3.5 to 4.5 feet tall. In one case, that the body was described as being like 5 feet tall or thereabouts. Now, in some of these where they were stored in this like chemicals to preserve them, they got a good look at them, and in some of the cases they were described as looking like the typical greys as they're known, so these grey-skinned, large-headed, and with like the big black insect-like eyes. So it does fit in with sort of the same entities that people see in abductions as well.
Now, that's fascinating. I even remember reading the report from the FBI.gov/vault website that they declassified some documents on the Roswell incident, and I think it was Agent Hoddle. He said that he saw 3-foot beans, but he didn't really get into detail, but he said there was 3 in each craft, and there was 3 craft, and they were about 3 feet tall. It's interesting that was 333 there, but that's fascinating indeed. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, that there's definitely a mystique to that area out there. I wonder if maybe there's some type of hybrid program or something like that. That's incredible. Could you describe maybe 1 or 2 stories out of your book that kind of had a big impact on you with the military/aliens, whether dead or alive?
Well, yeah. I mean, when you sort of look into these stories, this is sort of as I said earlier, this is the one aspect of the subject that could blow the secrecy wide open if we could get our hands on one of these bodies, or even a body portion of it. But I guess for me, what really stands out is when you're speaking to the witnesses. You're speaking to an old guy in, say, his late 80s, who is telling you how 60 years previously he saw this strange body, and it sort of, altered his life. I mean, really, it sort of radically altered his life and his belief systems, and never forgot it. So I think sometimes it's not just the story that stands out, which is, the stories are amazing enough, but it's sort of sitting opposite the person and getting, seeing their emotion as they tell the story of this sort of secret they've held for so long, fearful that, they talk about it, somebody still might be listening, so to speak. So it's, I guess for me, it's sort of like the human angle, the human interest angle that really sort of stands out as much as the story, really.
Absolutely. And you also talk about Men in Black. I was wondering if you could get into all the details that you know about the Men in Black, because there's so many different possibilities there.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is that the real Men in Black are actually nothing like Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones, in the movies. The movies are, they're good fun. Well, they're good fun. They're entertaining. But in the movies, the Men in Black sort of work for this super secret government agency that is answerable to no one, and it works outside of the government, etc., etc. But if you listen to most of the witnesses, the Men in Black reports, for people who don't know, actually go back to the late 1940s and were really at their height in the 50s and 60s. But I still get a lot of reports today And I've written 3 previous books on the Men in Black, so I get a lot of feedback from people who read the books and want to share their own experiences. And in nearly all the reports I have, and certainly most of the reports that surfaced in the 50s and 60s from people like Gray Barker and then later John Keel and people like that, most of the Men in Black are described as actually not looking fully human. They very often are described as extremely pale looking. One person actually described their skin as like the color of a sheet of paper. I mean, that white. And they have these bulging eyes that they sometimes try and hide by these sort of wraparound sunglasses. They're very often quite short, only about 5 feet tall, very thin. And they wear these old-style black suits and black fedoras, which they pull down tightly, and then when you've got the sunglasses on, you can barely make out much of the face at all. And they even seem to have the ability to sort of alter or control people's minds, almost like put them into a hypnotic state when they threaten them so that the person won't sort of fight back. So in other words, the real Men in Black that the witnesses talk about sound like aliens or kind of like an alien hybrid that's trying to pass among us by, sort of skillfully trying to camouflage itself. But I've got about 14 or 15 Men in Black and also Women in Black cases in the book, where the typical scenario, and this sort of applies to most of the ones in the book, is that somebody has a fairly significant UFO encounter, and what happens is that perhaps within a day or so at the most, usually, they might get a series of weird hang-up phone calls in the middle of the night. Somebody gets a call like 3 in the morning and they jump out of bed worried that it's bad news. So they go to the phone, as most of us would. They pick the phone up and there's either this weird static down the line or there's like a really fast chattering in a language that nobody's really able to understand what it is. And then after that, there are sometimes like an old Cadillac or a Chevy will drive past the window the next day really slowly. And there are reports then there's like they push the intimidation even further by knocking on people's doors late at night. And as I said, with this mind control angle, people feel compelled or impelled to open the door and invite them in. It's almost like their mind has been enslaved and they're forced to let them in the house. And when they do, then the Men in Black, in this sort of strange, odd, robotic voice almost, warn them never to talk about what they've seen. And the person is sat there on the couch in kind of this hypnotic daze, if you like, unable to fight back or get rid of them. And it's only when they've left the house that the person kind of comes round and out of this foggy state that they're in. So, in other words, the real Men in Black are far removed from the Hollywood versions, and that is kind of the way that's sort of like the classic scenario that I just described, the weird way they looked, how they act, the mind control aspect, and, it's all sort of part of this bigger mystery. And there are a lot of weird paranormal overtones to Men in Black stories as well, where, for example, sometimes when people have the Men in Black in their homes, within about like 24, 48 hours, very often the witnesses fall sick, almost like they've been sort of supernaturally infected. And it's taken time, to try and figure out what was wrong with them. And sometimes doctors were just completely baffled. There have been other occasions where sort of violent poltergeist activity has broken out in the house. And on other occasions, like strong odors like brimstone, and sulfur sort of fills the house, again with this sort of like paranormal overtones. So it's, very ominous. The Men in Black mystery is sort of a very ominous mystery, a weird mystery that actually sort of parallels a lot of sort of supernatural activity as well as, things that you'd find in the UFO field as well.
That's fantastic. And have you ever heard that story about, I think it was either Dan Aykroyd or... Well, Dan Aykroyd definitely had a really cool story about Men in Black, but also there's a story about Steven Spielberg and how he was essentially like one of his friends saw him from behind and was trying to catch up with him, and then all of a sudden he looked back, but not all the way, punched something in on a phone, and then these people appeared out of nowhere, and then he essentially disappeared. Have you heard about that?
I actually haven't heard of that one. No, I haven't heard of that one. I know the Dan Aykroyd one, but no, I didn't know that one.
There's some amazing stories. So do you think almost that these Men in Black could almost be like a holographic projection almost?
Well, actually, that is one of the interesting theories, the idea that because the Men in Black are so elusive and we never catch them, one of the theories is that when the person gets this sort of threat in their living room not to talk about it, that it may not actually be like a physical man in black sitting opposite the person. One of the theories is that it could almost be like the person's placed into this hypnotic state, and what they're actually faced with is like almost like something in the Matrix, where it's like a temporarily like a dream world that's created for you, and it's so sophisticated you don't realize you're in this almost sort of like a dreamlike state. You know, if somebody else was in the room with you, they might just see you sat there with a blank look on your face, just frozen on the couch. But to you, it would be very real. You would see the man in black enter the room, you would get the threat, and then you would see him leave. But it would be like, as I said, like the Matrix. It'd be like a sophisticated hologram that was so real that you would swear, you know, that it was real. So that is one of the interesting theories about who or what the Men in Black might be, that some sort of alien intelligence projects this holographic threat, which would be far more easy and convenient than actually having hundreds of real flesh and blood Men in Black going around and silencing people.
Now, do you think there could be both?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's one of the interesting things about the Men in Black and why I like to write about it, because there are so many different theories. You have the holograph theory, you have the idea that they are just physical Men in Black, you know, some whether aliens or time travelers or paranormal or whatever. But then you also have other theories that, you know, could they be something that's sort of more supernatural based? People draw parallels with old vampire legends. You know, the Men in Black come out at night, and when they knock on the door, they wait to be invited in, which is like the old vampire legends. You know, they had to be invited. They couldn't just sort of cross the threshold, so to speak. So this has given rise to the theory that perhaps some old vampire legends could actually have been based on early reports, centuries-old reports of Men in Black encounters that were sort of mutated then into vampire legends. And there are some cases where, you know, if you go back to the 50s and you see how the guys dressed back then, you know, like the FBI and the CIA, they did wear sort of the suits and the trench coats and the fedora hats. So I think in some cases, a small number, they actually could have been government people. But the category that clearly aren't the government is when they have this sort of really weird look, you know, where they don't really look human. So in other words, we've got a lot of theories: the government angle, the vampire parallels, time travelers, interdimensional, extraterrestrial, supernatural. There are so many different theories, and maybe, you know, it gets really confusing because there could actually be more than one type. You know, perhaps you know, there could be multiple ones. For example, things like you may have heard of like the Shadow People and the Hat Man. They're kind of similar, and even in more recent years, things like the Slender Man, which was actually an internet creation, but which has got so much interest and belief that one of the theories is that when there's a strong enough belief on enough people, it can create like a real life version. It's like the mind creates something and it becomes alive almost. And even the Slender Man kind of looks like a man in black, you know, this sort of skinny, tall guy in a black suit that sort of comes out at night primarily. So there's so many different aspects to the mystery.
Yeah, that's incredible. And if we could also talk about the black-eyed children into detail, maybe. I've heard several stories about how they come to your house, they ask to get let in. But you know what? Let me jump back for a second, because I want to talk about the blood deal with aliens and extraterrestrials. I know people that are related to certain, what some might consider aristocratic people, that they would have like vats of blood in their fridge. When they would go over to this person's house, they had blood in the fridge, like by the gallon amount, and this person doesn't know why. And let's just say there's specific blood types lined up with this, and there's a lot of what people might consider contacts and experiences, and even the reptilian factor is involved with this. So what's your take on that?
Well, yeah, I actually did a book that sort of covers, I think, some of the things you're talking about a couple of years ago called Bloodline of the Gods, which looked at a small percentage of the population which have what they call basically Rh negatives. It means that the so-called rhesus factor in their blood is actually negative, whereas the vast majority of the population is positive. And people who have Rh negative blood, or who are Rh negative, they have a number of interesting physical and also sort of psychological differences. For example, there are a lot of reports where the Rh negatives have an extra vertebra in their back. They're not able to tolerate heat and sunlight as well as everybody else. And very often they feel drawn to the UFO subject, or they've had sort of profound contact or abduction cases. And this has given rise to the idea that perhaps tens and tens of thousands of years ago, experimentation was undertaken on early humans. You know, we're Homo sapien today, but, you know, things like Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal man, that experimentation may have been undertaken on them and essentially created like a human alien hybrid almost, which was Rh negative, and that perhaps the genetic fingerprints and genetic memories almost of these early manipulations of the equally early human civilizations may still exist in the bloodline today, and that may explain why so many people feel drawn to the UFO subject when they're Rh negative, but they're not sure why. And it may be because there is some sort of inherited memory based upon, you know, what went on thousands of years ago. So the whole issue of blood as it relates to sort of the elite and to abductions and things like that is actually far more common than people realize.
What's your take on the blood? This person thought it was like pig blood or something like that, and I asked why that it was in this individual's fridge, and she doesn't know. What's your take on the blood thing? Have you ever heard about...
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, the bloodline angle really doesn't involve sort of people drinking blood. It just means their blood is different to ours. Now, you know, it may well be that, you know, perhaps it's being used for transfusion in some way. You know, I mean, I'm sort of speculating without you sort of knowing the full facts, but I mean, it could be sort of a transfusion thing, you know, to sort of keep the blood pure, maybe. That's probably the closest thing I could think of. I mean, because, you know, as humans, we're just not built like for example, you take like a bat, like the so-called vampire bat, you know, which lives on blood. It's you know, its internal organs and everything are completely different to ours. You know, we could not survive by drinking blood. You know, aside from the fact you probably throw it up the minute you go down your throat, but you could not survive on it. Our body just cannot digest it and turn it into energy and food, etc. So yeah, that's a bit of a puzzle, but it's, you know, it's an interesting story.
Now, another thing that I was hoping we could talk about, Nick, is the black helicopters phenomenon. And one thing that I remember back, this was in 2000 actually, in Cincinnati, Ohio. I lived in the suburbs out there at the time. I had a 2-story house. And I remember one night I looked out the window and I see this black helicopter that's literally just hovering there. Now, mind you, we're in the suburbs of Cincinnati here, and there's a house to the right of me, a house to the left, and then a park in between us, like a small little plain-filled park, you know, where you could go out and kick a soccer ball around or something. But the way that this helicopter was hovering, it was essentially maybe, I don't know, 20 feet, 30, 40 feet max above the house, and it was to the right. So, and it just hovered there, and you couldn't hear it. It was totally silent, and it hovered there for almost an hour. It was the weirdest thing I ever saw. What kind of black helicopter phenomenons, experiences have you read about and researched?
Well, actually, quite a few. I've got 4 or 5 cases involving black helicopters in the book, which go from the 70s right through actually almost to the present day. Now, there are sort of 2 different categories of black helicopter, which I'll explain, and I'll also explain where the black helicopters are often seen. For example, they're very often seen at the site of so-called cattle mutilations, or the wider phenomenon of animal mutilations. Particularly in the 1970s, as I point out in the book, the FBI investigated a number of cases of cattle mutilation where ranchers whose animals had been attacked and killed had seen unmarked black helicopters flying over the ranches, or they'd seen what they thought were military helicopters, like U.S. Army helicopters in the vicinity. Now, one of the theories was that they were responsible for the mutilations, perhaps some sort of biological warfare experimentation, or they were looking for emerging viruses in the food chain, sort of worse things than like mad cow disease. Or one of the other theories is that they were sort of like a secret monitoring team that were trying to figure out who was doing the mutilations, and so they had these sort of quick reaction helicopters to try and catch the culprits in the action of actually carrying it out. But in saying that, there's another much weirder aspect to the black helicopter phenomenon, and that's where they sort of sound more like the one you described, where, if anybody's ever stood near a helicopter, they make a hell of a lot of noise. They're sort of beating when you've got the rotors going around and so forth. They make a lot of noise. But oddly, there are a lot of reports where people have seen black helicopters, usually late at night, but sometimes in the day, and they can be within sort of 30, 40, 50 feet of them, and these helicopters are completely silent. Now, some people have suggested that maybe a technology has been developed which allows for an almost completely silent helicopter. And maybe that's possible. But there's another weirder aspect where people have said that these silent black helicopters sometimes have sort of just suddenly changed into like a large ball of light, almost as if the helicopter was like a camouflage, and it almost sort of like shape-shifted, I guess, from a helicopter to a ball of light, or vice versa. And this has given rise to sort of an even more controversial theory, the idea that the UFO intelligences, the entities behind the UFO phenomenon, can camouflage their craft in multiple different ways. And one of the ways they camouflage them is by having this ability to, whether it would literally change its shape, or they can project the image of a helicopter over their craft so that we don't actually see what they really look like. So, there could be actually several different things going on with the black helicopters rather than just one.
And I'm looking back, and it wasn't 2000, it was 2001 when I saw this. It was after the 9/11 events, and man, it was just wild. So the silence thing, you couldn't hear anything, and just the fact that it was so close to these houses and it hovered there was just very odd. There was no markings on it whatsoever. Now, reptilians, you talk a lot about the reptilian phenomenon. If you could maybe give us a couple of cases that you've put together in your book, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. Well, the whole issue of the reptilians, again, is like a very controversial one, but it has a long history attached to it, where people have seen, well, the best way to describe them, they're almost like an upright bipedal dinosaur. You imagine, or something like straight out of The Creature from the Black Lagoon. So, it's very controversial, but that's the best way I can describe them, sort of like a real-life creature from the Black Lagoon, something along those lines. And there have been a number of cases, several of which I talk about in the book, where people have told me of their experiences where they've been abducted, and not abducted by the so-called little greys, with a big head and the black eyes, but by literal reptilian creatures that were described as anywhere from about 7 to about 8 feet tall, very sort of imposing looking, and most of the people got like a scary vibe off them. They never sort of took part in the actual experimentation after the person had been abducted. It was almost like they were standing in the background, just overseeing and watching. Some witnesses felt that this was evidence that they were sort of overseeing it, that they were the ones in charge, whereas others thought they were almost sort of like soldiers just performing a specific task and making sure that nothing went wrong. But there are a lot of stories like that, and interestingly enough, a lot of the accounts involving the reptilians, and this is at odds with the stories of the Greys. Most of the stories with the Greys occur on board craft, but a lot of the reports I have of people who've had the reptilian experiences describe the events having occurred underground. In other words, they weren't taken to a UFO, but they were abducted, but they weren't taken to a UFO. They were taken to sort of underground caverns and caves, and even on a couple of occasions, allegedly military bunkers, where they saw the reptilians actually working alongside what looked like military personnel in sort of black outfits without any ID on them. And I got several of these particular cases in New Mexico, and also several around the Sedona area of Arizona. So, it's sort of another weird phenomenon, but when you put all the witnesses together, who don't even know each other, you actually see an interesting pattern coming together.
Have you seen the new series People of Earth, where it came out? Conan O'Brien's a big part of it, and there's a reason I'm asking this question.
I actually haven't. No, I've heard of it. I've seen it advertised, but I haven't seen it. No.
Okay. The reason I'm asking is there's the reptilians, there's the shapeshifters, there's the greys, and there's the Nordic, and each character represents something different, and they make it hysterical. But I almost wonder if they took actual accounts and experiences that people talked about and kind of made a spoof out of it, because the Nordic guy that goes around and has experiences, he just has experiences with women, and he's having sex with a bunch of women. And then the gray alien guy, he's like a grumpy old guy that you might have used to work with that you like, but he's always just complaining and swearing and cursing about stuff, never happy. And then there's the reptilian shapeshifter guy, which works in a news. He works at a prestigious news company, essentially, and he's like, he's a good-looking guy, got a lot of money and everything else. And these are the kind of things you hear about in experiences, but the way they put it together is almost like Parks and Recreation style. It's pretty interesting. Now, do you hear stuff about reindeers or deers with abductions and experiences?
No, I don't know of any involving reindeers, but everybody thinks of sort of cattle mutilations, and in some cases, cattle are taken away and they're not seen again. It's not just that they're mutilated, but I have heard a few stories where people have seen animals on board UFOs. I've got several cases where dogs were seen on board UFOs by people who were taken on board them, and I can think of a few cases like that, not many. I do remember one case in which like a horse or a pony was reportedly seen sort of taken into the sky by a UFO that seemed to have, like an anti-gravity thing. It was raising it from the ground. But no, I'm not sort of personally aware of reindeer ones, though.
I was wondering if there was like a trigger of some type, kind of like an implanted memory and stuff. Do you
Yeah.
write about the implanted memories and stuff like that on people?
Oh, yeah, I've got several of those cases in the book where people had seen, driving down a road late at night, and they were clear that they'd had a weird experience happen to them, and there was missing time, but they couldn't figure out exactly what it was. Now, in one case, a woman remembered seeing this large black van stop in front of her car on this lonely stretch of road in New Mexico, in northern New Mexico, and she couldn't get past. And the next thing she remembered, it was sort of like, this was like around 2 a.m. in the morning. Next thing she knew, sort of dawn was breaking at like 5 or 6 or something. And all she could remember was seeing this black truck. And eventually she decided to have regressive hypnosis, and it turned out that the black truck was just like a screen memory for a UFO landing. And the guys who got out of the truck were screen memories for these little diminutive greys. And I've actually got more than a few cases like this on file. I mean, if I'd used them in the book, all of them, there would have just been too many. It would have just been so glaring, So I think I used about 2 or 3 like that in the book. But I've actually got quite a few where screen memories are used, where somebody will see something, at the edge of the road, wholly down to earth, like I said, like a truck. Or in one case, I've got they saw a police car with the flashing lights, and they saw these 2 police officers sitting in the car looking at them, but the cops had this sort of really strange, eerie grins on their faces, and the person couldn't forget it. And then they decided to have hypnosis as well. And again, there was no police car. It was a UFO, and the aliens that took them had this sort of weird, their sort of jaws and face. They weren't smiling as such, but that seemed to be their normal state, so to speak. But the witness had sort of remembered it as a weird grin. So there are quite a few stories like that of deliberately sort of placed screen memories to hide what really took place.
Yeah, that's what was, I heard from somebody else too that they had heard that reindeer thing or as basically an implanted memory, and that's why I asked you. Now, you also talk about like aliens on the moon. So I figure if there's aliens out there, what a better place than the dark side of the moon. I've seen some crazy anomalies on the moon. Talk to us about that, Nick.
Well, yeah, this goes back to the 1970s when the U.S. government set up this program called the so-called remote viewing program, which essentially involved training people with psychic powers to try and spy on the Russians and the Chinese, etc. So basically, trying to use their mind to penetrate things like Soviet missile bases and Chinese underground bunkers and things like that, and to try and psychically pick up on what the enemy was doing. But there's another aspect to this which surfaced a few years ago, which sounds not quite like the original remote viewing program, which primarily was directed against like the former Soviet Union, the Chinese, and and other potentially hostile nations. But there seemed to be sort of an outgrowth of this project, or it may well have been a completely separate one. We still don't really know, but where some agency within the intelligence community was very keen to have the remote viewers remote view the moon. And this was because, with hindsight, it seems, they were suspecting or suspicious that something was going on the moon. In other words, sort of intelligent activity was going on there, and they wanted to try and figure out who or what it was. And a number of remote viewers are brought in to look at the moon and try and pick up some sort of sense as to what was taking place. And there were a lot of imagery of massive underground bunkers and installations deep below the surface of the moon, where there were very human-looking beings, but there were certain differences which, the way they could pass among you, and you might not notice them too much, but if you looked close, you would think, has that person got some sort of genetic condition? They looked human, but there was something that was just slightly off. But what's particularly interesting is that several of the remote viewers had to sort of break the contact, because they felt that when they were sort of spying on these entities on the moon, those same aliens, or whatever they were, picked up on the fact that somebody was watching them, and they were able to sort of turn the tables on them and then try and psychically spy on whoever it was that was spying on them. So they had to break the contact for fear that their cover would be blown. So very, very strange story. And all we know is that the man who was supposedly in charge of the project was named Mr. Axelrod. That's all we know about him. And it may not even have been his real name. It may have been sort of an easy way to use a cover name, so to speak, to prevent the remote viewers from knowing his real identity. But that was the name he used when he was talking to the remote viewers about, this is what we want done. It was always Mr. Axelrod.
Is that in reference to Ingo Swann?
Yeah, Ingo Swann was the primary one. He's not the only one, but he was the first one to talk about this. And since then, a couple of others have come forward to talk about how they were also part of this program. But Ingo Swann was the guy who really blew the lid on it, and talked about how one of Mr. Axelrod's colleagues contacted Swann and basically set up a meeting, and then he was flown to another location and blindfolded, and then to another location where he felt he was going down deep in an elevator. And then he was introduced to the team and basically told, we want you to remote view the moon, and whatever you see, doesn't matter what it is, just tell us, and because we're concerned that there's something going on there. And so many remote viewings were done by Ingo Swann that it became clear to him that the thrust was concerns that somebody else was on the moon, and they were trying to figure out who it was and what their agenda was.
Now, if I remember right, he talked about like a green mist and humanoids that were naked doing some type of mining on the moon as well. And I wonder if that was almost like a disinformation thing that he had to say or something. What's your take on that?
Well, yeah, that was one of the weirder aspects too. As I said, they were described as looking as quite human, but with a few differences. And the ones that Ingo Swann saw, he claimed or said that what he saw were these sort of humanoids, but they were naked, as you said, and they were involved in some sort of massive mining program deep below the surface of the moon. Now, what we do know is that Axelrod asked Swann on several occasions if he'd heard of certain books that had been written in the 70s, and they were all to do with mysteries on the moon. So clearly something was afoot. But what the outcome was, we don't know the full outcome, because it wasn't like really a two-way situation. With the original remote viewers, they were working quite closely with the CIA, to look for things like Soviet missile bases and things like that. But with the Axelrod scenario, it was more along the lines of, just tell us what you uncover and thank you very much. There wasn't like a two-way thing where they really gave much up as to what they thought was on the moon. Swann was pretty much forced to sort of go with his own devices, with his own gut instinct as to what was going on and why they were looking for whatever was going on there.
That's just fascinating, the possibilities. And I've also done enough research to know that the moon in and of itself is quite the enigma and anomaly. So I can certainly speculate as to what the situation is there. But, you've also put together a book that was called Immortality of the Gods. And does that talk a lot? I mean, do you break down the emerald tablets and stuff, or talk about the timelines of the immortality of the gods? Could you kind of give us a synopsis on that?
Well, yeah. I mean, this book's just coincidentally come out pretty much at the same time as the 365 Days of UFOs, because that happens occasionally, because I'm with several different publishers. So now and again, just purely by coincidence, one company will put one out, and then another one will put it out in the same week as well. So the Immortality of the Gods book is also out right now. That's basically it's a study of accounts and claims of immortality on the part of humans and aliens going back to sort of the earliest years of civilization, or even before that. So it begins with things like, the stories of the Anunnaki, which people like Zecharia Sitchin believed had achieved some sort of a degree of immortality, in the sense that, by our standards, they would be considered immortal, compared to our measly 85 years or whatever. But I also sort of go through, sort of a lot of other ancient texts, like, for example, the story of Methuselah in the Bible, who supposedly lived to 969, and how he was part of this lineage that went from, like, Adam and through, like, Methuselah, right through to Jesus and Noah. And the idea being that, could there have been some sort of genetic manipulation that created this human lineage, but that had extraterrestrial traits that gave them not immortality, but massively extended lifespans. And from there I go to things like King Gilgamesh, who reigned in what is now part of Iraq, and how he was supposedly a demigod, in other words, a cross between a god and a human, or, you could say a cross between like an alien-human hybrid. And he supposedly reigned for around about 130 years. And so clearly, if that's true, he wasn't a regular human. But there are some sort of interesting conspiratorial aspects to this, where there are a lot of rumors that when the Gulf War went on, when the invasion of Iraq and Baghdad in 2003, that as well as the accepted scenario that we know, about just going into, to oust Saddam Hussein, that supposedly there was also another project that was looking for the evidence of King Gilgamesh's knowledge of this sort of scientific technology that might allow for immortality to occur. And then it goes on through things like the Count of Saint Germain, and through to things like today, with science and technology, could we one day, become immortal, and what would it mean to be immortal?
So another thing I was wondering about too is the Stargate program out there that was talked about, where they actually found one, but that might just be internet, conspiracy kind of stuff.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Stargate stuff's interesting, but it is a little bit, for me, far out. The idea like a literal Stargate that the military's jumping back and forth and things like this. But there's no doubt that there are a lot of weird sort of extraterrestrial and UFO linked conspiracy theories surrounding the invasion of Iraq, and but the one that sort of really has lasted is this one that's sort of like a global elite looking for the answers in the ancient past, to try and figure out if in the present one day we might be able to achieve immortality, or more likely that it would be that elite that would have it, and the rest of us would be sort of left out of it.
Right. And this is
typical.
Absolutely. Now, this is kind of off topic. This is a different discussion. You did write a book with Tracy on this, Tracy Twyman, is that correct? Called Mind-Controlled Sex Slaves in the CIA?
Oh, no, that actually wasn't a book I wrote. What it was, that's the name of the book, but I was, a number of people, I think like 5 or 6 or maybe 10 people, something like that, were invited to write papers for the book. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I wrote like a 10-page paper on one particular aspect of sort of mind control and things like that, yeah.
Now, in that paper that you put together, have you done any research into false memories that are inserted in people to block out certain trauma that's been done to them with experiments and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, a classic example would be some of the early mind control experiments that went on, after the Second World War and the early years of the Cold War. Although I haven't actually written about this, I've got a couple of cases from the UK. There's a place in the south of England called Porton Down, which is where the British government does all of its research into things like biological and chemical weapons. It's a very sort of highly secret, sort of well-guarded installation. And in the 50s, the military did a lot of experimentation using mind-altering drugs like LSD, and they would sort of but basically dose up soldiers and see what the reaction would be. And sometimes, they were volunteers and were told, well, we're going to give you something and we just want to see the reaction. Other times it was done totally clandestinely, when something was dropped in a cup of tea or whatever. And they monitor these people, not just to see how they were affected, but how their memory was affected when they came around afterwards. And did they have like a full memory of what happened, or were their memories distorted? And one of the reasons for trying to figure this out was actually to try and see how and to what extent the human mind and human memories could be distorted and altered, so that you wouldn't have a full and clear understanding of something that happened. And of course, if you, for example, let's say, for example, hypothetically, the British got their hands on a Russian spy, they could interrogate that person and then subject them to some mind-altering drug where they might then think, well, was I actually interrogated by the Brits after all, or is it just some weird dream? It was very often done to try and confuse the situation so people wouldn't really understand what had happened to them.
Sure. And also, when people do attempt to come up with their past memories and think about what's happened to them in the past, a lot of times certain things will come up in their mind. One of the questions I had from a member of Leak Project that has actually gone through some of this mind control trauma, MK Ultra kind of stuff. When she goes into, when she tries to have past memories of specific memories that she feels might, kind of be, they don't want her to have, she'll have visions of like a TriStar Pegasus. Have you ever heard anything like that?
No, I haven't. No.
Okay. Okay. Much appreciated. And then also, there's a lot of stuff going on right now with Antarctica, and possibility of pyramids, and you've heard about the stuff with Germany in the 40s.
Yeah.
What do you know about Antarctica?
Well, I've got to be honest, I haven't investigated any Antarctica stuff. I mean, what I would say, you're right. I mean, there's a long history of weird stuff concerning Antarctica going back literally decades, like you said, to the 40s. Stories like alien bases, accounts of supposedly like long-lost human civilizations from tens of thousands of years ago that might be sort of inhabiting, the vast underground areas of, Antarctica, sort of massive caverns deep below the surface of Antarctica that we know nothing about. So a number of cases like that, and of course there are rumors about Adolf Hitler and UFOs having been built there, sort of Nazi sources, that kind of thing. So there is sort of like almost like an entire research community that's drawn to the whole Antarctica thing. And I've read quite a bit about it, but I personally haven't investigated that angle at all. So.
Sure, no problem. And if we'll jump back to your book that you just came out with, and maybe a couple more questions before we close out tonight.
Sure.
365 Days of UFOs, which is available at nickredfern14.blogspot.com. Make sure to use the code LEAKPROJECT when you check out. And if you go to nickredfern14.blogspot.com, you're also going to have access to a plethora of different blogs and information, also the different books that Nick's compiled over the years, 40 different titles, and each one of these things has some good information to bring to the table. I would strongly recommend any one of them if you're into the ET phenomenon, paranormal, monsters, cryptozoology, fringe, just information that's compiled in a way that's easy to read, and it's also got that wow factor, that pop. I really appreciate your work, Nick. No, if you were to, if you were to think of maybe a couple of different stories that you put in 365 Days of UFOs that just makes you go, that's incredible, that really kind of shakes your mind a little bit, could you share that with us here at Leak Project?
Yeah, sure. Well, one of the ones that really stands out is in relation to crop circles. Everybody's heard of crop circles, these massive formations that primarily turn up in England, and specifically the southwest of England for the most part, pretty much every summer. And, these are massive, highly intricate formations that occur sometimes in no time at all, and it's sort of, it's become really sort of part of England's culture. People go down there to see the crop circles, whether they're crop circle researchers or not. It's like families will say, oh, let's go down and see the crop circles. But what's intriguing are some of the weirder aspects to the crop circle formations that have been found. For example, one of the cases I talk about in the book involves a man who actually saw like a Mothman type character or figure hovering over one of the formations late at night, and he'd actually felt compelled to go down to Wiltshire and to the formations, not really knowing why. It's just a case of sitting on his couch, and then this overwhelming feeling came over him that he had to go down there, and saw this sort of dark-coloured humanoid figure with his red eyes and a pair of large bat-like wings, but hovering above the crop circle at a height of about 30 feet or thereabouts, and he just kind of stood there and for a few minutes. But there was, from some of the things he said, it did kind of sound like there may have been sort of a missing time aspect attached to all that as well. So, I find that kind of intriguing too. But I think the other one as well, which you've very briefly mentioned, and it's sort of more of a modern day phenomenon, is that of the black-eyed children. Now, I've got, again, sort of 2, 3, 4 stories in the book of people encountering these black-eyed children, which for those people probably aren't many, but for those who may not be aware of the phenomenon, people report, they're not unlike the Men in Black stories, where there's very often a knock on the door late at night. The person opens the door, and there are these usually 2 children who look anywhere from about the age of 10 to about 14 or maybe 13, and they're very pale skin. They usually wear black hoodies, and they keep their heads and their faces pointing downwards. And like the Men in Black, they try and find a way to have the house owner invite them in. Can we come in? We're hungry. Can we have some food? Or can we use the phone? We're lost. And it's all about trying to get the person to invite them in rather than them forcing their way in. But for the most part, people don't let them in because when they catch sight of their eyes, which are just sort of solid black, the entire eye is black, they just freak out and slam the door. But there have been some cases where the person has said they felt as if their mind was being altered and they were being forced almost to open the door to them and invite them in. But as I said, there are parallels like those we discussed with the Men in Black and the black-eyed children. And although a few reports have surfaced suggesting they've been around longer than we might think, the fact still is that most of the reports are from the modern era. And as I said, I've got 3 or 4 of those cases in the book, and they're all very, very, very strange, And again, there are theories like, are they aliens? Are they something paranormal? Are they hybrids? There's even the theory, could they be demonic? So there's a lot of different theories, but unfortunately, not many answers yet.
Absolutely. Well, there's so many different possibilities and factions and information out there that people have to really shift through to find the gems. And I've heard about secret treaties and allowing experiments on humans for exchange of technologies. With all the information that you've done, have you ever been able to find any solid data on treaties or exchanges or information that pertains to stuff like that?
Not what I would call hard evidence. I mean, I've got quite a few stories about people where, there have been alleged meetings between extraterrestrials and representative government and military. Some attempted meetings that were aborted out in the desert and things like that. So, they're interesting because they sort of mirror each other, and, sometimes it is a case of where there's smoke, there's fire, and but I have to admit, I don't have any hard evidence of these sort of meetings and pacts, but, there are more than a few of them in ufology, there's no doubt about that.
What do you think the ultimate goal is for these off-world factions? Do you think that there's multiple? Do you think that there's multiple agendas? Do you think that there's an off-world faction right now that actually controls the world at the top levels in many of these mystery schools and secret societies?
Well, I think there could be several different agendas. I mean, it's kind of like us. You look at the human race, and we rarely do what we do just for one reason. There's multiple reasons why we do this or we do that. We're friends with some nations, we're enemies with some nations. So I think it could well be the same thing. I think it would be a little bit too simplistic to view aliens as, quote, good versus bad, when it's hard to do that with the human race. You know what I mean? It's everybody has a light side and a dark side to them. You know what I mean? It's just how we react in different situations. And I think sort of an agenda that seems terrifying to us from an extraterrestrial perspective might not be to them. It's kind of like, if you look at the beef industry, well, as humans, we don't hate cows. I've never met anybody who hates cows, but, a lot of people eat beef, but they don't have anything against cows. It sounds like a simple analogy, but it could be something similar, that if we see horrific things done to us like abductions, people might think, well, they're our enemies, or they hate us, or they have a sinister agenda. But it could be a similar thing, that we're just their version of cattle and they don't hate us, but they see no problem with using us. And, so far at least, we haven't been destroyed by them. So that suggests they're not outright dangerous. But on the other hand, it doesn't mean they're friendly. It just may mean they have their own reasons for keeping us around, which might not actually be because they want to help us, or they might seem like that to us, but it could be, like I said, like with the cows in the field, it has another agenda that we're not actually seeing. And I think, for me, that's probably the more likely scenario. Not that they're good or they're bad, but we haven't seen the bigger picture. We see the entities, we see the craft, but we're still not seeing what it is that they're doing and why they're doing it. We're just getting part of the picture. And when you've only got part of the picture, it's difficult to tell if they're good, bad, or somewhere in between.
I've wondered before if we're like an energy source for them, not necessarily a food source, but some type of energy source, which in return could be a food source as well. Have you ever found any documents or anything that pertains to like the military being freaked out because they uncovered something that shows we are so far below these beings or entities at a technological level that it would be like the natives taking on a battle tank or something like that with bows and arrows?
Well, I actually haven't come across documents like that, but the point you made about energy, I've actually got quite a few stories like that where people, particularly in the presence of the Men in Black, a number of witnesses have said that when Men in Black was sitting opposite them, they started to feel weak. And they got the shakes and didn't feel well, and so the breath became shallow. And some of them felt like they were going to pass out because they felt just so exhausted and weak. And with hindsight, they all kind of said the same thing. They felt that the Men in Black were sort of bleeding them dry of energy, as if the Men in Black didn't eat food like we do or drink liquid, but they literally kind of absorb energy, into their bodies, like almost like using us in like a parasitic fashion. And I've not just with the Men in Black, but I've got that in other cases of paranormal activity and UFO activity where the people felt as if their life force was being sucked out of them, or in some cases they felt like their soul was being stolen, and some of them even felt that the greys, so to speak, were like soul stealers, that they were sort of stealing the energy of the human soul.
Yeah, I've heard that before too. That's incredible, the possibilities. Certainly hope not. You want to be able to think your soul is safe and stuff. And I remember watching a movie that Vin Diesel was in. I can't remember the name of it, but it was after Pitch Black or something like that, where this extraterrestrial race was like a beefed up version of Rome, where essentially they would conquer planets, and you could either join them or die, essentially. And if you joined them, they would take in all the good stuff and all what they felt was pertinent and just destroy the rest. But yeah, I remember this one part where this guy wasn't going to conform, and he ripped out that person's soul, and everybody's like, "Whoa!" And he just kind of like sucked it up and ate it, and then the person, withered away. And you've heard of the stories of Loosh or something like that, like a soul energy, which ETs harvest off of. Maybe there's, I that's very interesting to think about. Certainly, the possibilities are very frightening. And at the same time, I guess you don't want to lose sleep over it and stuff like that, but those are certainly things to think about. And Nick, I got to tell you, it's been great to speak with you. I mean, every time I talk to you, you bring something new to the table, which is definitely not your typical rehashed information. You've got a lot of stuff out there which is cutting edge, and I appreciate you staying on top of that kind of stuff for us. It's always nice to hear what you have to say. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us before we close out tonight?
Well, I think we've pretty much covered
Cool.
nearly the entirety of ufology, I think. So.
Great. Okay, well, fantastic. Folks, check out nickredfern14.blogspot.com. Your Immortality of the Gods, Woman in Black, Nessie, and then your most recent book, which just came out, 365 Days of UFOs, a Year of Alien Encounters, and make sure you use the code Leak Project. Thanks, Nick. This has been great.
Thanks a lot, Rex. Thanks a lot.
Really appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this edition of Leak Project. I am your host, Rex Bear, and we have famous Nick Redfern with us again, author of 40 awesome, mind-bending, incredible books. You can go to nickredfern14.blogspot.com, pick up your latest book of Nick's. I'll tell you, it's just, I was telling Nick before we started talking, he puts together incredible books like some people put together blog posts or Facebook posts. I mean, just so much information, up to 40 books now. This is incredible. I've read several of his works, and they never disappoint. His newest book, 365 Days of UFOs, is mind-bending. We're talking dead aliens held in military bases, men in black, black-eyed children, black helicopters, reptilians, aliens on the moon, and more. 365 days of goodness. Hey, it's great to have you on the show with us here at Leak Project, Nick. How the heck are you?
Hey, Rex. I'm doing good, thanks. And thanks for having me on again.
Absolutely. We definitely need to do this more often. I always enjoy speaking with you, and I know that the times we've talked in the past, literally, I mean, just the information you gave us as an audience, I had to digest that over several weeks because it was just so powerful, and it really makes you think. One of the questions that I want to ask you before we get started is, with all the research that you've done, compiling 40 books of incredible data, a lot of this stuff is declassified information from the military, Department of Defense, etc. Do you believe in a lot of these stories?
Well, yeah, I mean, what I try and do with any investigation is, you try and be unbiased and just see where the story leads. And, when it comes to things like UFOs, I think, from my perspective, there's a lot of different things going on, and each case needs to be sort of looked at on its own merit. I think some UFOs are legitimate craft and beings from somewhere else, whether they're extraterrestrial or multidimensional or time travelers or who knows what they are, but there's something from somewhere else. But equally, I think some UFOs are probably highly classified military vehicles that, they're still on the, hidden behind the scenes. They're not sort of out in the open yet. And so I think, that's why it's important to just look at the case and investigate it in the same that you would if you're doing any sort of investigative journalism. You just go where the facts are and then present it for the reader rather than try and force fit anything into any particular belief system.
That's what I like about you, Nick, and I do my best to be as neutral as possible on the Leap Project as well when we interview guests, so that way we can find out their truths. Now, if we could get into the dead aliens held by the military, I mean, talk to us about some of that. Is this new information that you've recently obtained?
Yeah, I mean, basically what it is with the book, as you mentioned, it's like called 365 Days of UFOs because each day of the year has a different UFO case concerning it. And I think there are like 5 or 6 stories I've got in the book where people had related to me accounts where either they or family members had seen the remains of what we could only really call dead aliens held by various military agencies. And several of the ones I talk about were in the United States and one in the UK and a couple more. But they're also they're intriguing because they follow a pattern, particularly with the American ones, where a lot of this activity reportedly stems from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. Now, in the late 40s through the early 50s and through to the late 60s, we know for sure that Wright-Patterson was a hub of UFO research and activity at the time. And that was because that essentially is where all the research was done. Now, there's a full admittance that research was being done into UFOs at Wright-Patterson at that time. But the other story, the more controversial one, that there are sort of bunker-type environments deep below the base where there are these alien bodies preserved in sort of cryogenic storage or preserved in chemicals. Those stories have been officially denied. And yet we have a lot of old-timers, military old-timers, come forward talking about seeing them. And the 3 or 4 cases I've got in the book from the US, as I said, various days of various years, they're eerily similar, where people were taken down into deep vaults, sort of 30, 40, 50 feet under the base itself, and into these chambers where they saw what looked kind of almost like missiles like lying on their side. But then as they got closer, they could see they were tanks containing these small bodies. And as I said, in some cases, they were sort of in like a frosty cryogenic situation to preserve them. Others were packed in chemicals, and they were typically described as very small, about 3 to 4 feet high, with large heads, and sometimes large black eyes, and other occasions almost like a slanted human eye. And many of these people didn't speak out until their sort of grandparents or the grandfather who told the story had passed on. And this kind of demonstrates almost like the fear factor that the people have even decades later about should we say anything or not. So it's it's an interesting part of UFO history, which if we could get to the bottom of it, could actually blow the whole thing wide open, really.
Now, you said some of them were underground, like maybe 30, 40, 50 feet.
Yeah.
Were those all in Dayton, Ohio, or were those in different areas?
Well, the ones that I talk about in the book were below Dayton, Ohio. But there are other stories that have surfaced as well, such as allegedly being, again, sort of massive bunkers deep below Area 51 in Nevada, and where there are claims about similar storage. There was also a story about Norton Air Force Base in California that at one point in the 50s was supposedly a place where a number of bodies at least were held. So, but what's interesting is that it's not like we get stories where these bodies are supposedly scattered around all across the US. It's interesting because it seems to be this same handful of bases over and over again.
Did they describe the details of the beans? Were they like what you would see your typical grays in the Hollywood films?
Well, kind of similar. The problem was for some of them, when they saw them where they were sort of cryogenically frozen, and it was the glass was kind of frosty and things like that. It was hard to get a full picture of them, but they were all sort of unanimous that they were humanoid with oversized heads, and anywhere from about 3.5 to 4.5 feet tall. In one case, that the body was described as being like 5 feet tall or thereabouts. Now, in some of these where they were stored in this like chemicals to preserve them, they got a good look at them, and in some of the cases they were described as looking like the typical greys as they're known, so these grey-skinned, large-headed, and with like the big black insect-like eyes. So it does fit in with sort of the same entities that people see in abductions as well.
Now that's fascinating. I even remember reading the report from the FBI.gov/vault website that they declassified some documents on the Roswell incident, and I think it was Agent Hoddle. He said that he saw 3-foot beings, but he didn't really get into detail. But he said there was 3 in each craft, and there was 3 craft, and they were about 3 feet tall. It's interesting that was 333 there, but that's fascinating indeed. Right, Patterson Air Force Base. That there's definitely a mystique to that area out there. I wonder if maybe there's some type of hybrid program or something like that. That's incredible. Could you describe maybe 1 or 2 stories out of your book that kind of had a big impact on you with the military/aliens, whether dead or alive?
Well, yeah. I mean, when you sort of look into these stories, this is sort of as I said earlier, this is the one aspect of the subject that could blow the secrecy wide open if we could get our hands on one of these bodies or even a body portion of it. But I guess for me, what really stands out is when you're speaking to the witnesses. You're speaking to an old guy and say, his late 80s, who is telling you how 60 years previously he saw this strange body and it sort of, altered his